I'm Nadia Gurwell.
I'm John Goliatino.
I'm Michelle Blanchard. Welcome to 30 Minutes.
Welcome to 30 Minutes. My name is Bob Opatzner. I'm an attorney who's head of litigation at the law firm of Collins and Hannafin in Danbury, Connecticut. I've been part of a series on Comcast of education programs on the law. And tonight's program is on special education. I am using in this case, in this discussion, two special education teachers and having their perspective on certain important issues on special education, and that will be the focus of tonight's program. I'll introduce the two guests I have tonight. To my immediate right is Dawn Jara, and to her right is Wendy Franklin Opatzner, and to show pure transparency, Wendy is my wife. Good evening, ladies.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Dawn, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a special education teacher in Fairfield County. This is my 10th year teaching, and I'm currently a doctoral candidate studying universal design for learning.
Thank you. Wendy?
I'm a special education teacher in Fairfield County. I work with high school students. I have a certificate in math and a certificate in special education. I currently work with a group of students who have a very high level of need and need a high level of support within the public school system.
Dawn, what is special education?
Special education is a continuum of services and supports that are the purpose of them is to provide, support to help students access the general education, to be able to, achieve their maximum potential and achieve a high school diploma.
Wendy, what is the goal of special education?
It's to help overcome some of the barriers to access to the general education curriculum and settings so that these students with disabilities can partake to the maximum extent possible in the same education as other students.
Is there a certain age level for students who are eligible for special education services?
Birth. Under the law, we are responsible to educate students beginning, or provide services for students beginning at birth. We provide services for students from birth to 3, which is one set of services, usually done through a different agency than the lead educational agency. Then we provide services for students at preschool age, that's ages 3 to 5, and that is through the local educational agency. And then for the normal school age, 5, possibly up till 21.
Age 21 is when special education services end in the school systems?
Age 21 is the maximum age. Through the 21st year, there are students who will, once a student accepts their diploma, if they're ready to move on to the next stage of life, which is the majority of our students with disabilities, that is when they will end their eligibility for special education.
Dawn, how does one determine whether a child is eligible for special education services through a school district?
Well, there's a referral process, and so if a teacher or a parent or a school counselor or anyone who knows that the child suspects the child of having a disability, they would put in a referral to special education. And basically that's just filling out a form in writing, sending it to the school, just saying, we suspect the child has this disability based on these concerns that we're observing, and we would like to explore our concerns further and meet to discuss them.
Wendy, is it the duty of the school district to find a child who has special education needs, or is it the duty of the parent? How does the role work out?
Child find is one of the mandates of the law. The name of the law is IDEA, and it is the
IDEA.
And one of the things that the school district has to do is identify students who are suspected of or in need of special education. And that would include students who are in non-public schools. That would include students who are migrant or transitory. It would be any student within that district.
Dawn, does there have to be a connection between the child's disability and the ability to learn in order to qualify for special education services?
Right. So students can have a disability, but if it doesn't impair their ability to learn, then they might qualify for just accommodations or modifications under the Civil Rights Act and have a 504 plan. But if the disability impacts their education, then they would qualify for special education and related services.
So if I understand it correctly, there's essentially two paths, so to speak, for children who have certain needs. One would be the special education path under IDEA, and that has to be something connected to their ability to learn. Is that correct?
Correct.
And the other path might be a 504 accommodation program. That's a Civil Rights Act. Is that correct?
Correct.
And in order to have a 504 accommodation, it does not necessarily have to impact their educational ability. Is that correct?
Correct.
Is that the key distinction, more or less, between a 504 and an IDEA special education situation?
Correct.
And tonight in the show, we're going to focus mostly on the special education aspect. Wendy, are there certain criteria when the referral happens? And perhaps maybe Dawn might want to answer the question, either of the two of you. When you get this referral, whether it be coming from the parent, a teacher, or someone in the community, however it gets to you or to the district, what happens from that point in time when the referral comes in? Whoever wants to take that question?
I'll start and then
Sure.
Dawn will take it. The school district has 45 school days from the date of referral to determine whether they think the student has a disability and perform any necessary evaluations to make that decision, and if so, to develop an individualized education plan.
Is that known as an IEP?
That's known as an IEP. That's if they determine that the child is eligible.
So if I understand you correctly, the first step is a referral is made of some type to the school system. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is there a form or something that you have that you follow in the school district through the state of Connecticut for that intake on the referral form?
Yes, there is.
Okay? And do we want to explain how that works a little bit?
Sure. So on this document, it asks whoever's filling it out, whether it be the parent or the school district, to identify what are their areas of concern, what strategies have been tried, and then that document, goes to the school, and there's a series of meetings that happens in that 45-day period that Wendy mentioned. So at the initial meeting, the team discusses the referral, discusses the concerns, and they also review any evaluation data that exists, any school records that may be present, any anecdotes shared from the teacher or staff working with the child. And then at that point, the team has to determine whether or not they need additional evaluations to kind of answer their questions. So that meeting can go two directions. A comprehensive evaluation could be planned based on the information that still needs to be collected, or the team might decide general education supports can be put in place and no evaluation would be requested. If an evaluation is requested, however, evaluations be planned on whatever the disability or whatever the suspected disability was. So every student wouldn't get the same battery of tests. The test would be planned based on the concerns. And so the school district would request these evaluations writing of the parent. The parent would either sign consent or deny consent, and then the evaluations would commence.
So if I understand you correctly, the referral comes in, there are some meetings that are part of a process, not one meeting, but part of a process.
Correct.
All within that 45-day period. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then what happens is, in that setting of meetings, are those meetings called a PPT meeting?
Yes.
And PPT stands for?
Placement and planning team.
Okay. So you have those kinds of meetings, and the parents are invited to come,
Yes,
and in some cases the students come if they're of a certain age,
absolutely.
and you also have people from the school district who are part of the process.
So there needs to be a mandatory representative from the district that can allocate funds. There needs to be a general education teacher, a special education teacher. There needs to be a representative who can understand and interpret evaluations. The parent is always invited. After a certain age, the student is always invited. And then anyone else who may have data that is relevant to the decision. Parents are also have the right to invite anyone that they would like to bring as well.
Wendy, are there outside experts who are consulted as part of the referral process to determine whether or not the child does have special needs to be qualified under IDEA?
So there are basically two PPTs that occur during this process. The first PPT is one where we discuss whether we need to have evaluations and what those evaluations would be in order to answer the questions or concerns we have about the student's performance at school or their accessing their education. During that time, in that first PPT, which we often refer to as level 1, that is when the decisions will be made about what evaluations are needed based on the concerns. And that could include, for instance, a psychiatric evaluation. Then the next meeting is called the level 2 meeting. And that would be where you reconvene to discuss the results of those evaluations, make the determination as to whether the child is eligible for special education or ineligible. And if they're deemed eligible, that is when the IEP is developed and a full IEP with services and supports is developed, where we decide what are the needs, what are the goals, what are the services and supports and accommodations and modifications.
So therefore, if I understand you correctly, there must be some criteria that you as a school district, have to follow in order to determine whether a child meets the criteria of being a special ed student. Dawn, how does that work?
Well, there's 12 categories under IDEA that a student can qualify for special education and related services. So depending upon what disability is being evaluated for, there are certain checklists that mirror each one. So for example, if a student was being assessed for a social emotional disability, that would be one checklist. If a student was being evaluated for a learning disability, that's a separate checklist. If a student was being evaluated for a speech and language or a communication disorder, a separate checklist. So that would be dependent upon, each criteria is different depending upon.
And the form that's used for the IEP is a state mandated form?
Yes.
Yes.
And you go through the process and you figure out for this particular child, based upon the information the school district receives, regardless of the source that you've mentioned so far, the determination then is made at the end of the referral process as to whether or not the child meets the criteria to be deemed to be a special education student. Is that correct?
Yes, and that all happens within 45 school days.
And tell me briefly, let me just jump from that topic a little bit. Tell me the population that you service, Wendy. Do you have a certain population of students that you service?
Yes, I'm part of within my district, I'm part of a cohort, which is a group of educators, related service personnel, working with our students with a very high level of need in multiple areas. So what makes them unique would be the high level of support that they need and the high level of services that they need. And it usually includes social, emotional / behavioral. It usually will include academic. It will likely it almost always includes, because I work with older kids, what we call the transition areas, which are independent living, vocational skills, and employment, which become part of an older student's IEP. And this particular group, and we do meet once a month, is really set up to provide those types of supports.
Once a month for the particular student?
I'll be a little more clear. As a group throughout our district, all of the personnel from elementary through high school who work with this population of students within special education that we've identified as needing these very specialized constellation of supports and services, we meet as a group to set up our structures, to discuss some of the issues and what would be best practice working with this type of population, because their needs are different. Most times we have a very high or very low student to teacher ratio. We often have support staff, meaning a paraprofessional or very specially trained person who's trained in specific ABA methodology, which I can describe later, working with our students.
ABA methodology, what is that?
ABA methodology, in simple terms, is a scientifically validated approach to looking at behavior and learning, where we try to understand it in terms of the function the behavior serves and the environments in which it occurs. Traditionally, a lot of people think of it as only involving behavior, meaning how a child behaves, or whether they're off task or on task, or whether they become very anxious or agitated, task avoidant, but learning itself is a behavior. And most of us learned to write, let's say, through a prompting system. We started with a model, then maybe we had dashed lines. And those very simple things where you want a behavior to occur that has not yet occurred, that prompting, that shaping, reinforcing, which can just be praise. Those are some of the methodologies that we use and look at in order to promote learning, particularly for students who have, many of whom have a longer learning curve and are going to need very, specialized and systematic instruction in order to progress.
Dawn, when Wendy said there's certain support and services, what does that mean? What do you mean by support and services?
Well, for every student, it would be individual. So supports might be a general education teacher and a special education teacher teaching in the same setting. Supports might be a paraprofessional. It could be a counseling center staff, meetings with a school psychologist or a social worker. It might be a consultation with a speech and language pathologist. So it really depends on what the disability is and what the student needs.
So if I understand you correctly, you're in this process, the referrals come to the district, you do certain evaluations and information obtained, you decide the child needs special services, and if so, the PPT, perhaps the last one as part of the determination, will result in an IEP where the child will be assigned certain services and help and whatever is needed to help that child deal with the disability he or she has in order to help them in their educational process. Did I say that about right?
Well, the real idea is that special word FAPE.
What's FAPE?
A free, appropriate public education.
And that's required by IDEA, is that
That's
not true?
required by IDEA. So the idea is that when we are done designing and developing the individual education plan, that we are ensuring that that student receives an appropriate public education.
One of the other hallmarks to add on to that under IDEA is not only do they receive that free public education, but they also receive it in the least restrictive environment.
Yes.
And so when the staff is developing this IEP, we look to see what are the students' needs, but what also are their strengths, and how do we build upon those strengths and include them in the general education curriculum without excluding them.
Dawn, early on you mentioned something about the word funding. Am I correct to understand that when you develop your IEP for the child, consideration is not given to the cost? Is that correct? It's given more to what the child's need.
To the need.
Dawn, what's your population that you service?
So like I mentioned, special education is a continuum of services. So the students I work with, are classified in all of the 12 categories. I work primarily in the general education setting. So I consult with general education teachers. I work in their classrooms, say like an English classroom, a math class, a chemistry class, and really provide the services to the students while they're alongside their typical peers. I also service students who are in a smaller group setting, and we might work on, say, either reading skills or skills related to like executive functioning, time management, self-advocacy. And then there's also, on occasion, the times when students need one-on-one instruction. And so, like I mentioned before, we want to educate students in the least restrictive environment. So majority of their time is going to be spent in general education, but if the need arises, we remove them.
There's a concept I believe I've heard called mainstreaming. Wendy, what does mainstreaming mean?
We use the term today called inclusion.
Was it formally called mainstreaming?
It was formerly called
Okay.
mainstreaming.
What is mainstreaming and/or inclusion? What does that mean?
So mainstreaming was probably the earlier term used, and it meant that you put students in a general education or regular education environment, and that was considered mainstreaming. When we started using the word inclusion, we really meant that we also expected the general education teacher to take ownership of that student, and not just to say, this student is in my class to receive the benefits of being with typical peers, but to say this student is a full participant in my class, and I will have to include them in my curriculum and consider them in my instruction. That may be with the support of a special education teacher, either through consult, collaboration, or co-teaching if need be.
And that also includes extracurricular activities as well, is that not true?
Well, extracurricular activities is really a separate section. So extracurricular activities, what we really want to make sure is that if a student needs supports to participate in, not so much instruction, but supports to participate in the same extracurricular activities as every other student wants to participate in, that the school district provides that support.
So let me ask you a
So
question.
if I have a student who wants to participate in the band, and the band has a pep band on Saturdays, or I have a student who wants to be in the orchestra, and the orchestra has performances, and that student needs some type of support. Maybe they can't organize their music. Maybe they can't get out to the field independently. Maybe they're good with all of that, but they're not reliable to transition in and out of the car and get to the right place. That the school district provides that support so they
the
can
child,
access.
that way the child who has special needs is deemed to be like everybody else. Essentially can go on the band trip or whatever. In fact, are there situations where, for example, there might be a child who is part of a club that goes to New York City, for example, to see a show? Is part of the process to make sure that that child is no different than a general ed student. So the child gets to go, but he might need or she might need certain help. Is that true?
Correct. We never want to exclude a child based on their disability.
I want to talk to you about another area, and we're running out of time a little bit, but this could go on for a few hours, but that's okay. This is a half-hour show tonight. One area of the law that I get involved with is I represent students sometimes who get involved in disciplinary problems. And under the statute in Connecticut, there is a requirement that if a child's going to be expelled from school, which means out of school for more than 10 school days, there has to be something called a manifestation hearing. Do you know anything about manifestations, Dawn?
Yes.
Could you tell us what is a manifestation hearing in connection with the disciplinary action for a child with special needs?
So when a student is going to be either suspended or expelled, like you mentioned, they're out of school for more than 10 days. And so at that point, the school-based multidisciplinary team needs to get together and ask two questions. Was the behavior a result of the student's disability, or was it a result of the district's failure to implement the IEP? In other words, denying the student of FAPE. And so again, that team convenes a PPT, that planning and placement team meeting, and we review the evaluation data. We review the student's disability. We review the actions of the behavior, and we ask, the team asks itself those two questions. Was it a failure to implement the IEP, or was it a manifestation of the student's disability? And depending upon the answer, if it was found to be a manifestation, well then, the PPT or the IEP, the individual education plan, needs to be reevaluated and looked at, and the team would determine, are there any other supports and services that need to be in place, any additional instruction, or if it's determined to not be a manifestation, then the school district can go through with the expulsion.
So therefore, if the child, if it's found that the child's disability is what caused him to do what he did or she did, then that would change the methodology and approach to whether and how the child might be disciplined.
Absolutely. They can't be punished for something that they did as a result of their disability. Oftentimes, in a manifestation, an evaluation will be recommended, a functional behavioral analysis. So if the behavior in question is determined to be a manifestation, well then that team wants to learn more about that behavior and why is it happening, what are the antecedents, and then what are the consequences of it. So an FBA would be requested, and if the parents agreed to it, would be conducted, and then that team would meet again to review the results, and then programming would be put in place, whether it be a support plan or different instructional strategies.
So therefore, if a child were found to have his disability was what caused him to do what he or she did, the child might be dealt with in a different way than an expulsion or suspension, but there might be some kind of behavioral plan implemented for that child.
Right.
Yes, Wendy?
I would just like to add, because one of the things about the population I work with is that we do have a multidisciplinary team working with all of my students, and we do meet weekly, and that includes a speech pathologist, a physical therapist, an occupational therapist, psychologists, social workers, and a certified BCBA or certified behaviorist. We have a certified behaviorist who comes to our group a set number of times per week to collaborate and consult both on learning objectives and behavioral objectives. So I just wanted to say that FBAs are a hallmark of our practice too, and are often done to figure out the function of the behaviors that we'd like to reduce or increase, because many of my students have difficulties with behaviors that don't work that well in the environments they're in and would be better replaced. And we work on a set of positive supports to do that.
It is
And the first step
I'm
is
sorry.
an FBA. Sorry, first step is an FBA.
It's obvious to me in this, we only have 2 minutes left in the show, but it's obvious to me you both have great pride and care for the students who you work with. I'd like each of you to share perhaps a little story that you may have, or something that's meaningful to you about the kinds of children you've dealt with or results you've had. Wendy, why don't you start?
A while back, I had a student that I first met through observation at a non-public school where he had been placed through the district. The district felt he was ready to come back to school, and the parent was very frightened, and it resulted in a due process hearing. He was returned to the public high school, and his mother very early on and I had a conversation, and our relationship didn't get started on the best foot because she was afraid to bring him back. But we talked a lot about how well many of my students were doing and that they were participating in the graduation process. And I told her that her son would someday be doing the same. And years later, on the day that he received his diploma and walked the graduation line, she texted me, because I couldn't find her at the end, to congratulate them. I had seen them before, and she texted me and said, "Do you have a tear in your eye?"
And did you?
Yes, I did.
Thank you very much, ladies. Unfortunately, Dawn, we're out of time today, but you mentioned the word due process, and perhaps if we do another show on special education, we may get into that topic more detail. It has been a pleasure having you two ladies here on this edition of 30 Minutes. The topic of special education is one that's very important to discuss, and I appreciate the knowledge you gave to us. Thank you very much. This is Babel Potzner. Good evening.